A quiet marina, a worn-down boat, and a veteran no one thought twice about, until he was forced to leave. When Captain Ray Donovan was kicked out of the only place he called home, no one stood up for him. 48 hours later, the silence was shattered by the thunder of warships entering the harbor. What followed was not just shocking, it was a reckoning. A forgotten hero remembered, a community humbled, and a man's quiet dignity reshaped an entire town. Before we get into this unforgettable story, make sure you are subscribed to Epic Story Moments and hit the bell, so you never miss another tale that truly matters. Captain Ray Donovan lived on a modest sailboat docked at a quiet marina nestled along a sleepy stretch of the coast. He was a retired Navy officer in his early 70s. His posture still held a quiet strength, though the lines on his face told of long, heavy years. To most, he was a man of few words, polite, calm, always up with the sun. He spent his mornings repairing old rigging, patching sails, or sharing quiet fishing tips with local children who wandered the docks. When elderly boaters needed help, he was already there, tightening ropes or lifting gear without ever asking for thanks. But not everyone welcomed him. The marina had begun to change. Shops were being replaced with wine bars. Wooden planks were being swapped for polished tiles. The new manager, Bryce, was a sharp-faced man in his 30s, more interested in glossy yachts and investor lunches than in retired veterans with rust-stained hulls. To Bryce, Ray was a blemish, an anchor holding back the marina's sleek transformation. He saw Ray's presence as old, unsellable, and inconvenient. And in quiet meetings behind glass doors, he made it clear, Captain Donovan did not fit the new vision. One morning, new regulations were nailed to the marina board. Bryce stood beside them, arms folded, watching as boat owners read the fine print. All vessels were now required to meet updated visual and performance standards. Ray's boat, despite being seaworthy and spotless inside, was labeled outdated and aesthetic risk. Ray read the notice in silence. Then he walked to the office with his logbook and maintenance reports. Every inspection had been passed. Every safety box was checked. But Bryce refused to even look. "You have 48 hours to vacate," Bryce said flatly. "No exceptions." The regulars, those who had once accepted Ray's quiet kindness, stood in the shadows. Some glanced at him with guilt. Others looked away. No one spoke up. Ray returned to his boat and sat alone, staring at the water. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He simply began to pack. Tools into boxes. Charts into leather folders. One by one, the memories of decades at sea folded away. He turned down offers from passers-by who timidly asked if he needed help. He told them he was fine. And he meant it. Dignity was not something he was willing to surrender. Not even now. Inside the cabin, as he wrapped his metals in cloth, the silence was broken only by the creak of the dock and the faint slap of water on the hull. He had led men through storms and fire, and yet here he was, discarded by his own countrymen, unseen, and slowly disappearing. That final night, a slip of paper fluttered under the door of his cabin. Ray opened it slowly. The handwriting was unfamiliar. The message was short. "You were a hero once. Some of us never forgot." He stared at it for a long time, his eyes misting slightly, before folding it carefully and placing it in the front pocket of his coat. At dawn, he untied the lines without a sound. A few dockhands noticed but said nothing. He started his small dinghy and pulled his old sailboat away from the marina. No one stopped him. No one waved goodbye. By the time the sun crested the hills, Captain Donovan was a fading speck on the horizon. Whispers stirred that evening. Someone had seen the note. Others recalled old stories, rumors of medals, missions, and brave things done long ago. But the whispers were shallow, half-hearted. No one dared challenge Bryce. 2 days passed. Then, on the morning of the third day, as Bryce stood laughing with potential investors on the pier, a sound broke the stillness. A long, deep horn rolled in from the sea. Then another, and another. People stopped. The air shifted. The sound grew louder, closer, steady, heavy, undeniable. All eyes turned to the horizon. And there, cutting through the fog, came the gleam of gray steel, the ripple of flags, and the unmistakable presence of a full military fleet, pulling directly into the harbor. Bryce stood frozen, trying to make sense of the sight before him. Warships, real, imposing, steel giants, now rested where leisure boats once lounged in the sun. The town's modest harbor had been transformed into something out of a military film. He rushed toward the docks, shouting orders, waving his phone, demanding explanations. But no one on the ships responded. Uniformed personnel moved with quiet efficiency, ignoring his frantic presence. Then, from the largest ship, a woman stepped forward. Her presence silenced even the wind. Commander Janelle Torres. Straight-backed, sharp-eyed, every step she took sent ripples through the watching crowd. She asked only one question. "Where is Captain Ray Donovan?" Bryce, caught off guard, stammered about policy, outdated vessels, regulations. Commander Torres did not blink. "That man saved lives that mattered more than your Marina's profits," she said, each word cutting through the silence like a blade. Locals began to gather. They heard her voice, her words. Shame crept into their expressions. People who once kept their heads down now began to remember the man they had quietly admired, yet allowed to be pushed out. Commander Torres turned to the crowd and spoke plainly. "This fleet will remain, by private order, in honor of a man who never asked for praise." And just like that, the balance shifted. In the days that followed, stories began to surface. Some whispered, others shared aloud on porches and sidewalks. Maggie, the widowed owner of the town's little marine supply store, came forward first. She had known Ray's late wife. "When she was dying," Maggie said softly, "he stayed up 3 nights with me at the hospital. He would not leave her side, not even to eat." Then young Eli stepped forward. 17 years old. Head down, voice shaking. "I was going nowhere," he admitted. "Skipping school. Drinking. Ray found me passed out behind the boat shed once. He never told anyone. Just cleaned me up. Told me to show up every morning. I did. He taught me to sail. He made me show up for myself." Others followed. People began knocking on doors, stopping in grocery aisles, sharing memories they had kept buried. A couple Ray helped during a winter storm. A family he comforted after their son's funeral. Broken engines he repaired. Groceries he delivered quietly to the homes of those too proud to ask for help. The Marina, once fractured, began to hum with unity. Commander Torres listened to every word. She stood quietly, taking no notes, saying nothing, until one moment when she finally spoke. "Heroes should never be exiled," she said. And then she walked away. The fleet began transforming one of the ships into something unusual. Crews worked around the clock. By the 3rd morning, a large banner was raised above the deck. In bold lettering it read, "For the Forgotten Soldier." Word spread fast. A tribute ceremony was planned. Veterans from neighboring towns were invited. Flags were polished. Music rehearsed. The ship would serve as a floating memorial, not just for Ray, but for all those like him who had been pushed aside. Bryce was unraveling. He called lawyers, threatened lawsuits, shouted into phones that stopped answering. His investors had seen the headlines. They were walking away fast. His empire of polished decks and plastic smiles was collapsing around him. Just before the tribute could begin, a shout rose from the end of the dock. A small, sun-faded boat appeared on the horizon. A battered dinghy in tow. All eyes turned. Someone whispered, then another shouted louder, "It's him!" Captain Ray Donovan was coming home. His beard had grown thicker, his skin tanned by sea and sun. He looked tired, but he stood tall, eyes locked on the harbor that had turned its back on him. As he docked, he saw the crowd, the flags, the faces, and then the silence broke. From every deck of every ship, sailors stood at attention. One by one, they raised their hands in salute. Ray's voice cracked when he asked the only question he could manage. Why? No one answered with words. They just kept saluting, and the Marina fell completely, overwhelmingly silent. As the silence of that solemn salute lingered over the water, Commander Torres stepped forward once more. She faced Ray directly and spoke not as an officer, but as someone deeply indebted. "I was a cadet," she said, 24 years ago. "My unit was trapped during a mission gone horribly wrong. Enemy fire on both sides, no reinforcements. We had almost given up hope." Ray's eyes searched hers, trying to remember. She smiled faintly. "You never asked for names. You just came, pulled us out one by one. You carried my commander on your back while injured yourself. You never spoke of it afterward." Ray blinked slowly, the memory now faint but alive. "I was just doing my duty," he said. Commander Torres shook her head. "You saved futures. My crews. And more than you will ever know." She turned to the crowd, her voice rising. "He never wanted medals. So he vanished. But I could not forget. I spent years trying to find him. When I finally did, I told the Navy leadership. I told them who they had let drift into obscurity." She paused. "That is why we are here." The crowd stood stunned. Every eye reflected regret. Because the man they had watched walk away was never just a quiet old sailor. He was a hero, and they had let one man's vanity drive him out. Ray stood quietly, the weight of memory pressing down. He was never one for speeches. He did not like being the center of attention. He cleared his throat. "I never wanted any of this. I came here for peace. I fixed boats. I watched the sun rise. That was enough." Someone in the crowd asked gently, "What do you want now?" He looked out over the marina, eyes falling on children, on elders, on weathered sails and new hands. His voice was steady. "I want this harbor to be open to everyone, not just the ones who can afford to impress." Commander Torres stepped forward. "Then let us help," she said. "The Navy will fund a full restoration, new docks, training programs, scholarships. We will name it in your honor." Ray hesitated. "Only if it stays open. For the kid with a second-hand boat. For the widow with groceries to deliver." Torres nodded. "That is the promise." Just then, a commotion stirred at the back. Bryce, surrounded by two plainclothes officers. They walked him out without drama. He said nothing. His empire of arrogance had quietly collapsed. His name would not be remembered here. Weeks passed. And then came the day no one would forget. The community gathered once more, this time beneath fresh banners and flags that rippled in the sea breeze. An iron plaque stood at the entrance of the newly christened Ray Donovan Harbor. And beneath his name, a line carved into steel, "For service without applause. For courage without witness." Veterans from every coast began arriving. Some came with canes, others with medals. All came with stories. Quiet stories of a man who had helped, guided, saved. One by one, they greeted Ray, not as a celebrity, but as a brother. A towering flag was raised, its base etched with names Ray had never forgotten, the ones who never made it back. It stood as a reminder that this moment was not about one man, but all who gave without question. As Ray stood before the crowd, the children he had once taught how to fish, now dressed in cadet blues, stepped forward. They saluted him, and Ray's voice caught in his throat. No speeches followed, only the sound of a naval hymn drifting through the air as the sun dipped low. And in that golden light, the harbor felt whole again. On the final evening, the marina shimmered with soft candlelight. Hundreds of flames floated gently across the water, each held by hands that had been touched, directly or quietly, by Ray Donovan's quiet acts of courage. The community stood shoulder to shoulder, faces warm with gratitude, guilt, and something deeper, reverence. Ray stepped onto the dock, his voice carrying just enough to hush the breeze. "I was thrown out of this marina," he said, pausing. "But now I know I never really left the hearts that mattered." There was no need for more. Commander Torres approached with a small velvet box. "The Navy rarely gives this," she said, opening it. Inside was the Navy Civilian Valor Medal, its golden edges gleaming under the dock lights. Ray stared at it for a long moment before gently nodding. The applause was not thunderous, but it was steady and sincere. At dawn, the military fleet pulled anchor. One by one, the ships glided out into the open sea, leaving behind something deeper than their wake. They left behind a legacy returned. Ray watched in silence, not as an exile, but as a cornerstone, a man whose dignity had outlasted the tide. In the soft narration that followed, the message was clear. It is easy to overlook the quiet ones, the ones who do not shout or seek attention, the ones who simply do good because it is right. Ray had never worn a cape, never asked for thanks, and yet he had done more for others than most remembered. His story echoed through the town, not as gossip, but as a lesson. Justice does not always roar. Sometimes it arrives in silence, carried by truth and patience. Redemption, when it comes, does not demand payment. It calls for courage. The town changed. It softened. The harbor was no longer a stage for luxury yachts and fleeting prestige. It had become something more, a symbol of shared purpose, of protection, of principle. Young cadets now gathered each week. They listened to Ray teach knotwork, navigation, and something deeper, integrity. And in every lesson, there was a piece of his story, a reminder that the strongest leaders often speak last and least. On a quiet morning, Ray sat on the edge of the dock, guiding a young boy as he steered a small sailboat out into the bay. It was the same boy who once called him just an old man. Now, he listened carefully, eyes locked on the horizon. Behind them, Maggie walked up and sat beside Ray, her gaze warm and familiar. "You came back," she said. Ray smiled faintly, watching the boy disappear into the light. "Maybe I never really left." The camera slowly panned back, revealing the full stretch of the harbor, calm and golden under the setting sun. Flags danced gently. Laughter floated on the breeze. And the water, once a place of exile, now carried hope. At the edge of the dock, nailed to the wood with quiet pride, sat a plaque. No gold, no ceremony, just a simple message carved into oak. For the one who never asked for honor, but always gave it. And with that, the harbor faded into twilight. But Ray Donovan's story stayed.